You threw something away today, maybe a banana peel, maybe a wrapper, maybe leftovers you forgot about in the back of the fridge. You did it without thinking. You will do it again tomorrow. But for almost the entire history of your species, that act, throwing something away, was not just unusual. It was something close to unthinkable. Not because ancient humans were more virtuous than you, not because they cared more about the planet, but because in the world they lived in, waste was not a concept, it was a death sentence. Every object that existed in the ancient world had to be found, carried, processed, and kept. There were no stores, no deliveries, no replacements. If you used something up and threw away the rest, you were not being careless. You were reducing your chances of surviving the next week. And your brain, the same brain sitting behind your eyes right now, was built in that world. It was shaped by 300,000 years of a single rule: nothing leaves the group that still has use. This is the story of what ancient humans actually did with everything they had, and it will change the way you look at the things you own. Start with the animal, because the animal is where everything begins. When a hunter-gatherer group made a kill, the event was not just a meal, it was a resource event, a cascade of extraction that could last for days. Anthropologist Daniel Lieberman at Harvard has studied how early humans processed large game, and what he found is almost incomprehensible by modern standards. Every part of the animal was assigned a purpose before the body was even fully processed. The meat came first, divided by cut, dried, or smoked for preservation, distributed by social rank and need. But the meat was almost the least of it. The bones came next, cracked open for marrow, which is one of the most calorie-dense substances a human body can consume. But after the marrow was extracted, the bones were not discarded. They were shaped into tools, into needles, into scrapers, into hooks. A single large femur could become multiple instruments, each serving a different purpose in daily life. Researchers studying Paleolithic sites across Europe and Africa have found bone tools that show evidence of extended use and repeated resharpening, meaning the same piece of bone was maintained and reused across weeks or months, not abandoned after a single task. The hide was stripped carefully and processed with the animal's own brain matter, a technique still used by traditional tanners today, turning raw skin into something soft and durable enough to wear, to sleep on, to use as a bag or a shelter wall. The sinew was pulled from along the spine and dried into threads stronger than anything you could make with plant fiber alone. It was used to stitch clothing, to bind tool heads to handles, to string bows. The fat was rendered and stored, used not just for cooking but for waterproofing, for lamp fuel, for skin protection in cold conditions. The stomach and intestines were cleaned and used as water containers. The bladder became a pouch. The tendons became rope. The teeth became ornaments, tools, or trade items. Nothing left, nothing was thrown away, not because ancient humans were following a philosophy, because in a world without replacements, every material was irreplaceable. This extended to plants with equal intensity. Ethnobotanist Gary Paul Nabhan, who has spent decades studying traditional land use among indigenous communities, documented the degree to which ancient plant use was total. A plant gathered for its seeds would also yield usable stems, leaves, roots, and bark, each processed differently, each stored separately, each serving a different need. Roots that were not edible raw were dried and ground into powder that could be mixed with water months later. Bark was stripped in layers, with the outer bark used for fire and the inner bark eaten or boiled into medicine. Leaves that were too bitter to eat directly were used as wrapping material for cooking, or dried and burned as insect repellent. Seeds that were inedible in their raw form were soaked, fermented, or roasted until they became digestible and calorie-dense. Every plant that entered camp left in a different form than it arrived, transformed, redistributed, used entirely. But here is the part that most people do not expect. The waste avoidance of ancient humans was not just about material objects. It was about time, it was about effort, it was about information. In a world where every skill took years to develop and every piece of knowledge was held only in living memory, wasting knowledge was as dangerous as wasting food. Researcher Joseph Henrich at Harvard has written extensively about cultural learning in traditional societies, the way information about tool-making, plant use, navigation, and weather reading was passed between generations with extraordinary care. A technique for waterproofing leather. A method for identifying which mushrooms were safe to eat after a wet season. A reading of cloud formations that predicted rain 3 days out. These were not written down. They existed only in the minds of people who had learned them from the people before them. Lose the knowledge and you could not recover it. Waste it, fail to pass it on, fail to practice it, fail to remember it, and the next generation faced a gap in their survival toolkit that could not be filled. This is why elders were so critical. Not just because they had lived long, but because they were the storage system, the external hard drive of the group. Every piece of knowledge they held was irreplaceable, and the group treated it that way. The same logic applied to fire. Fire was not something ancient humans could reliably produce on demand. Striking flint and catching a spark in dry tinder required the right materials, the right conditions, and significant skill. Archaeological evidence from sites in South Africa suggests that some early human groups maintained fire continuously for tens of thousands of years, carrying embers in slow-burning fungus or bark containers when they moved, never allowing the flame to go out, because letting it die meant starting from zero in conditions that might not cooperate. Fire was not wasted, not a single coal, not a single ember. It was passed from one generation to the next like a living inheritance. Now consider water. In many of the environments where early humans lived and moved, water was seasonal. It appeared during rains and disappeared during dry periods. Finding it, storing it, and rationing it was not a background task. It was the central organizing logic of movement. Groups did not wander randomly. They moved between known water sources along routes that had been memorized and refined over generations. Every drop that fell in a rainstorm was an opportunity, collected in animal stomach containers, in clay-sealed holes in the ground, in hollow logs. Nothing was allowed to absorb into the earth unused if there was any way to capture it first. This is what researchers sometimes call the cognitive load of scarcity. When everything costs something to obtain and nothing can be bought or ordered or replaced, the mind tracks resources with an intensity that modern life almost never demands. Psychologist Sendhil Mullainathan at the University of Chicago has studied the cognitive effects of scarcity in contemporary populations and found something striking. People operating under genuine resource scarcity show dramatically increased attention to efficiency. They notice small amounts. They plan further ahead. They are better at extracting value from marginal resources. This is not a learned behavior. It is a shift in how the brain allocates attention when it knows that nothing is coming from outside. Your ancestors lived in that cognitive state permanently. Not as a burden, not as a philosophy, but as a baseline. Waste was not a moral failing. It was a cognitive impossibility. The brain simply did not generate the impulse to discard what still had value because value was attached to almost everything. And then agriculture happened. And then cities, and then factories, and then packaging, and then delivery, and then subscription services that send you things you forgot you signed up for. At each step, the gap between obtaining a resource and understanding its origin grew wider. When you could buy a new container for a few coins, there was less reason to repair the old one. When meat came wrapped in plastic from a building you had never visited, there was no memory of the animal it came from and no instinct to use every part. When food arrived in quantities larger than you could consume, the surplus stopped feeling precious because more was always coming. Archaeologist Brian Hayden at Simon Fraser University has studied the transition from forager to agricultural societies and documented something important. In forager societies, he found almost no evidence of deliberate food waste. Storage failures happened, food rotted before it could be used, but intentional discard of still usable material was essentially absent from the archaeological record. In early agricultural societies, as soon as surplus became possible, evidence of waste began to appear, not because the people changed, but because the relationship between effort and resource had changed. When more is always available, less feels precious. You live in the end state of that transition. A world so saturated with available material that the very concept of waste has had to be reinvented as an ethical concern rather than a survival instinct. You recycle not because your brain tells you to, but because a campaign told you to. You compost not because every piece of organic matter is irreplaceable, but because you decided intellectually that you should. Your ancient ancestor did not need to decide. The decision was made by reality. Nothing went unused because nothing could afford to go unused. The world was the rule, and the rule was total. The next time you pull something out of the fridge and consider whether it is still good enough to eat, that pause, that moment of genuine calculation, is the oldest thing about you. It is the flicker of a 300,000-year-old operating system asking the question it was built to ask. Is there still something here worth keeping? The answer your ancestor always gave was yes. The question is whether you still know how to hear it.